President Donald Trump has been found guilty on all 34 counts in his New York criminal trial. He is now the first president in U.S. history to be convicted of a crime. KCAL News reporter Michael George has the very latest from Manhattan.
Donald Trump is now the first former president to be convicted of a crime.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Trump was charged with falsifying business records in connection with money his former fixer Michael Cohen paid to adult film star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 election to keep her quiet about an alleged sexual encounter. Prosecutors argued that Trump reimbursed Cohen, but disguised the payments as legal expenses, amounting to a criminal scheme to corrupt the election.
Welcome guys, Adam is here, so this is happening right now. A Manhattan jury said guilty 34 times, convicting Trump on all counts of falsifying business records, making him the first former U.S. president ever convicted of a felony. The moment marked a seismic shift in American history. The legal system held the most powerful person in the country accountable for the first time. The raw chaos framing is the most dramatically compressed possible description of what the reporting from inside that courtroom captures. A room saturated with the specific tension of the most politically consequential jury verdict in the modern history of American law. A tension that the judge had specifically warned against expressing in the form of outbursts that produce hushed gasps from observers, as the four-person's voice repeated the word guilty for the 3rd time and the 5th time and the 10th time and the 25th time and the 34th time. Trump sat expressionless or shaking his head slightly depending on which specific witness account you read.
One simple word, guilty, repeated over and over and over and over. 34 times those simple words, something that happens every day in courtrooms across America. But this time was different. This time about the current presumptive GOP nominee, a former American president, something we've never seen before. Those ladies and gentlemen of the jury, 12 members from everyday walks of life in New York City. We had a salesman, the foreman. We had 2 lawyers. We had someone who was a physical therapist, a speech therapist, all walks of life coming together for a unanimous verdict today, Lester.
This all occurred when we thought that the jury was about to retire for the evening and come back tomorrow. The court very much caught off guard, it appeared.
Lester, it had, because we were really not certain that we would see a verdict at all. The judge obviously wanted to accommodate that schedule, to do as much as they could.
The room did not erupt in the Hollywood sense of people jumping up and screaming, but it erupted in the specific constitutional and historical sense. The sense in which 34 counts of guilty from a Manhattan jury constitute the most dramatic and the most permanent form of eruption that the legal system can produce, because they cannot be walked back, cannot be revised, and exist in the permanent legal record as the documented judgment of 12 ordinary citizens who heard the evidence and applied the law and concluded that the former president of the United States committed 34 felonies. The prison alert quality of the framing is the accurate description of where the verdict put Trump's legal status. He is a convicted felon facing potential incarceration on a criminal record that no subsequent political development has erased. The unsealed is the least accurate element. The verdict was not sealed and was not unsealed. It was announced in a public trial that had been covered continuously from the moment jury selection began.
History in Manhattan Thursday. For the first time ever, a former president of the United States, convicted felon. 34 felony charges, the jury returning guilty verdicts on all of them. After a fairly quiet day, hours and hours of hearing nothing from this jury, at the end of the day, the judge was actually ready to release all 12 jurors and come back tomorrow, but they responded saying, no, we have a verdict, guilty on all counts. This was all stemming from hush money payments sent surrounding the 2016 election, trying to suppress damaging stories from the porn star Stormy Daniels coming to light that may have affected his chances in that 2016 campaign. And now the judge at the end of the day saying we will move on to sentencing. That's set for July 11th. Now, he could face jail time here, a maximum of 4 years expected, but for a non-violent first-time offender, non-drug offender, a lot of folks are saying probation may be the way this judge goes. We will not know until July 11th. That's 4 days before the Republican National Convention. Either way, Donald Trump now running for president once again as a convicted felon in the United States.
But everything else in the framing is pointing at something real, something documented, and something whose significance for the accountability story is as large as the dramatic language the headline deploys to describe it. Tonight, history made. Donald Trump becoming the first former president in American history to be criminally convicted. New York City, where he built his fortune, his name embossed on countless buildings, now the same city finding him guilty, making him a convicted felon. The 12 New Yorkers on the jury finding Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in the Stormy Daniels hush money case. Prosecutors proving that Trump falsified checks, invoices, and business records to conceal a $130,000 payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels to keep the story from voters just days before the 2016 election.
Tonight, former President Donald Trump found guilty, convicted by a Manhattan jury of all charges. Now the first American president ever convicted of a crime. Jurors finding Mr. Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying his business records to cover up a conspiracy to influence the 2016 election by hiding how he reimbursed his former fixer for paying off a porn star before the election. The Manhattan jury of 7 men and 5 women included 2 lawyers, 2 in finance, and the foreman in sales, and reached their decision after 2 days of deliberations, after hearing from more than 20 witnesses over 6 weeks. The prosecution's case largely came down to whether jurors would believe the word of Michael Cohen, Mr. Trump's former attorney and self-described fixer. Cohen was the only witness who directly tied Mr. Trump to the alleged crime of falsifying business records. He testified Mr. Trump directed him to pay off Stormy Daniels so she couldn't derail his campaign. She'd alleged a sexual encounter years before, but Mr. Trump vehemently denied it.
To understand why the verdict day in the Manhattan courthouse was as historically significant as the headline's most dramatic language suggests, why the hushed tension of the actual scene produced something more consequential than any courtroom explosion could have, you have to understand what the 34 guilty verdicts established in the permanent legal record and why their significance extends far beyond the specific criminal charges they address. The New York hush money case was built on the specific allegation that Trump falsified business records to conceal reimbursement payments to Michael Cohen for the hush money payment made to Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election. The specific charges, 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree under New York law, were on their face charges about business record keeping in a private company's books. But the prosecution's theory connected those business record falsifications to a broader scheme to influence the 2016 election by suppressing information that might have damaged Trump's campaign. The jury convicted on all 34 counts. That conviction is not just a finding that specific business records were falsified. It is a formal legal determination that a person who was simultaneously the President of the United States had committed 34 felonies. That the legal system's formal process of evaluating evidence, applying legal standards, and reaching a verdict had produced the specific finding that this specific person committed these specific crimes. The historical precedent is absolute. No president or former president had ever before been convicted of any crime. The 34 guilty verdicts created that precedent with a specificity and a comprehensiveness that no single count could have matched. The specific scene that reporters described from inside the courtroom during the verdict, the judge's advanced warning against outbursts, the hush that fell over the room, the foreperson's voice repeating guilty for each of the 34 counts, the few gasps from observers, Trump's expressionless or slightly head-shaking response is a scene that is more significant in its specific quality than a Hollywood-style eruption would have been. Courtroom explosions into raw chaos are the dramatic shorthand for moments whose significance overwhelms the normal rules of institutional decorum. The specific scene inside the Manhattan courthouse was something more constitutionally significant and more historically enduring than that. It was a moment whose significance was too large for the normal rules of decorum to contain, yet in which those rules held, in which the institution maintained its dignity and its formal gravity even as it was doing something that had never been done before. The judge's warning worked. The room stayed controlled, and the verdict was delivered with the specific solemnity and the specific formal precision that the most historically significant criminal verdict in modern American history deserved. The specific combination of the controlled formality of the institutional process and the world historical significance of the outcome is the specific quality of the verdict scene that the raw chaos framing is trying to capture in its most dramatic possible shorthand. The Robert Costello courtroom incident, the moment during the defense phase of the trial in which the defense witness visibly challenged the judge, rolled his eyes, made comments into the microphone, and was subjected to the judge's decision to clear the courtroom for approximately 10 minutes while the judge addressed the witness's conduct, provides the specific real-world incident of courtroom disruption that the raw chaos framing is most directly drawing on, even though it happened days before the verdict and had nothing to do with any verdict or unsealing. Costello was a witness whose relationship to Michael Cohen and to the legal strategy around the hush money payments made him a specific and significant figure in the defense's attempt to undermine Cohen's testimony. His conduct on the stand, the eye-rolling, the microphone comments, the visible challenge to the judge's authority produced a specific moment of institutional confrontation that required the most dramatic response available to a trial court judge. The temporary clearing of the courtroom to address the conduct outside the presence of the press and public. The press were out for about 10 minutes. Then they were readmitted. The trial resumed, order was restored, and the specific quality of that incident, the brief disruption, the institutional response, the restoration of order is the real-world basis for the entire courtroom ERUPTS framing that the headline deploys in its most extreme version. The unsealed federal filings that Jack Smith's team produced in the election interference and classified documents cases add a specific and important dimension to the Prison Alert unsealed verdict framing, even though those filings were legal briefs rather than jury verdicts. The specific Smith filings that argued Trump had resorted to crimes to cling to power were unsealed in the specific legal sense. They were filed under seal initially and subsequently made public through the court's unsealing process. Those unsealed filings, while not jury verdicts, were the prosecutorial articulation of the most comprehensive case against Trump that federal investigators had assembled, laid out in the public record in the form of legal briefs that use the most direct and the most specific language available to prosecutors to describe the conduct they believe the evidence established. The language of a resort to crimes to cling to power is the language of a prosecutor who has reviewed the full investigative record and concluded that the evidence supports the most serious possible characterization of the conduct being described. Those filings, unsealed and publicly available, are the specific element of the Prison Alert unsealed verdict framing that most accurately describes a real legal event in which sealed federal materials became part of the public record. The sentencing dimension of the hush money case, the specific fact that Trump was convicted and faced potential incarceration, that judges emphasized prison was possible rather than automatic, and that the specific sentencing calculation will determine whether the convicted felon would serve time, is the specific accountability element that the Prison Alert framing is most accurately pointing toward in its real-world application. A prison alert is an accurate characterization of the post-verdict legal status of any convicted felon who is awaiting sentencing on charges that carry potential incarceration. Trump was awaiting sentencing as a convicted felon on 34 counts of felony falsification of business records. That specific legal status, convicted, awaiting sentencing, facing potential incarceration, is the real-world basis for the Prison Alert framing. However, the specific sentencing outcome is ultimately determined by the specific judicial discretion that the judge exercised in the specific proceedings that followed. Now let us examine what the specific quality of the verdict day inside the Manhattan courthouse, what the reporters who were in the room actually witnessed and recorded means for understanding the specific historical and constitutional significance of the 34 guilty verdicts, and why the controlled, formal, institutionally dignified delivery of those verdicts was as consequential as any more dramatic scenario could have been. The most fundamental thing to understand about the verdict scene is that its controlled formality was itself the most significant form of the institutional accountability the legal system could have produced. A courtroom that erupts into raw chaos when a verdict is delivered is a courtroom whose institutional authority has been overwhelmed by the emotional force of the moment. The Manhattan courtroom that heard 34 guilty verdicts in the most politically consequential criminal case in American history maintained its institutional authority throughout. The judge's advanced warning held. The public gallery stayed silent except for the hushed gasp in the formal reading of the verdict, proceeded through all 34 counts with the specific dignity and the specific precision that the formal legal process demands of its most significant moments. That institutional dignity, the specific quality of the formal legal process maintaining its gravity and its decorum even in the face of a historically unprecedented verdict, is a specific form of the accountability the legal system produced. The raw chaos would have been less significant, not more. The controlled formality was the appropriate institutional response to the significance of what was happening. The specific reporting from inside the courtroom, the multiple first-hand accounts from journalists who were present and who captured the specific details of the scene in their dispatches, provides the specific documentary record of what actually happened and how it differed from both the raw chaos framing and from a casual observer's expectations about what a verdict of this magnitude would look and sound and feel like from inside the room. Politico's account described the drumbeat of guilty and Trump's blank stare. NPR captured the scene when Trump's verdict was announced in terms that conveyed the specific tension without any chaos. CNN described what it was like inside the courtroom as the 34 felony verdicts were delivered, emphasizing the controlled environment the judge had established. The New York Times provided the most comprehensive account of the specific atmosphere. The convergence of those multiple first-hand accounts all describing the same controlled, hushed, historically significant scene is a specific documentary record against which the raw chaos framing needs to be understood and honestly presented. The chaos was not in the room. The chaos was in the political and legal world outside the room where the 34 guilty verdicts immediately became the most contested and most consequential political development of the entire Trump era. The specific way that Trump received the verdict, sitting expressionless or shaking his head slightly as the foreperson's voice repeated guilty for each of the 34 counts in a sequence that lasted long enough for the full weight of each individual finding to land separately in the room, is one of the most historically significant details that the courtroom reporting captured, because it reveals the specific quality of the accountability moment that the verdict produced for the person most directly affected by it. Previous major criminal verdicts in high-profile cases have often produced visible emotional responses from defendants: tears, collapsed composure, audible reactions that visually communicate the human experience of receiving the judgment of 12 peers. Trump's response: the expressionless face or the slight headshake that the specific reporters who could see him described, is the response of someone who has been shaped by decades of public life to present a controlled exterior, regardless of what is happening internally, and who understood in the specific moment of the verdict that the public image of his response would itself be politically significant, that his supporters would be watching how he received the verdict, and that the specific demeanor he showed would communicate something about his relationship to the institutional process that was producing it. The controlled exterior was itself a form of political management, a deliberate choice to show a face that communicated that the verdict did not break him, that he rejected its legitimacy, that the expressionless non-reaction was its own statement about how he assessed the institution that had just convicted him, and the specific fact that the foreperson's voice said guilty 34 consecutive times while that controlled exterior was maintained, that the most consequential string of words ever formally directed at a former American president in a legal setting produced a specific response of expressionless blankness or minimal headshaking, is one of the most historically significant human details of the entire accountability era, and one whose significance the hush from the gallery and the quiet tension of the room perfectly complemented. The specific legal status that the 34 guilty verdicts created for Trump, convicted felon awaiting sentencing, the first president or former president in American history to bear that specific legal designation, changed the nature of every subsequent political and legal conversation about him in ways that are permanent and cannot be undone by subsequent political developments. He is a convicted felon. That designation exists in the formal legal record regardless of what subsequent political events occur, regardless of what appellate courts ultimately do with the verdict, and regardless of the specific political circumstances that have characterized the post-verdict period. The prison alert framing of the headline is the most urgently communicative shorthand for that legal status change. In its specific application to the moment when the verdict was delivered, it captures the specific quality of the accountability threshold that was crossed when the foreperson said guilty the 34th time in the Manhattan courthouse. The Costello incident's specific significance for the raw chaos framing is worth examining carefully because it is the real-world incident of courtroom disruption that most directly supports the entire courtroom erupts language, even though it occurred during a different phase of the trial and had nothing to do with the verdict itself. Costello was a defense witness whose conduct on the stand, the eye-rolling, the comments into the microphone, the visible disrespect for the judge's authority, produced a real and documented moment of courtroom disruption that required the specific institutional response of clearing the press and public and addressing the witness's conduct directly before the trial could continue. The judge clearing the courtroom is itself a form of the institutional eruption that the headline is describing. The formal assertion of judicial authority over conduct that has disrupted the formal proceeding in ways that require the most serious available institutional response. That the disruption was created by a defense witness rather than by the verdict announcement, and that it was resolved through the specific institutional mechanisms available to the court in approximately 10 minutes, is the specific factual detail that distinguishes the real-world Costello incident from the raw chaos framing's most extreme version. But the existence of a real moment of genuine courtroom disruption that required the clearing of the press and the direct judicial intervention is the specific real-world basis on which the raw chaos framing finds its most defensible grounding. The Jack Smith unsealed filings, the federal election interference and classified documents briefs that argued Trump had resorted to crimes to cling to power, are the specific legal documents whose unsealing provides the most direct real-world basis for the unsealed framing in the headline, even though those documents were legal briefs rather than jury verdicts, and were ultimately mooted by the dismissal of the federal cases after Trump returned to the presidency. The specific language of those filings, the argument that the evidence established that Trump committed crimes to remain in power, presented in the formal legal language of federal court briefs that had been previously sealed and were subsequently made public through the unsealing process, is the specific legal event that the unsealed language is most accurately pointing toward. Those briefs are public record. Their specific language about the nature of the conduct they describe, the resort to crimes, the falsification of evidence, the organization of a scheme to remain in power against the will of the voters, is the permanent public documentation of what federal prosecutors concluded the evidence established before the cases were dismissed on procedural and constitutional grounds that were explicitly not factual acquittals. So, what does the full picture of the verdict day, the Costello incident, the unsealed federal filings, and the sentencing status mean for the accountability story and where it stands in the current period? The first thing to understand is that the 34 guilty verdicts are the most consequential and the most formally authoritative accountability finding that has been produced about any American president in the modern history of the legal system. They are on the record. They are the product of the formal trial process, evidence presented to a jury, legal arguments made by both sides, the specific deliberative process that the jury conducted, and the formal legal system's most authoritative determination that the conduct described in the charges constituted 34 felonies under New York law. The prison alert, whatever the specific sentencing outcome, accurately describes the legal status of a person who is a convicted felon on 34 counts, and whose sentencing process carries the potential for incarceration that the conviction makes legally available. The second thing to understand is what the controlled, formal, institutionally dignified verdict scene, the scene so different from the raw chaos the headline imagines, reveals about the specific way that the legal system handled the most historically significant criminal verdict in the modern era. The courtroom maintained its dignity. The judge's warning held. The formal process proceeded through all 34 counts without the kind of disruption that would have undermined the specific institutional authority of the verdict. That controlled formality is itself the most powerful form of the accountability the legal system produced, more powerful than any chaos could have been because it demonstrated that the formal accountability process could maintain its institutional gravity and its procedural integrity even in the face of a verdict whose political and historical significance was genuinely unprecedented. The system worked. It worked quietly and formally and with the specific institutional dignity that the most significant accountability moment required. The third thing to understand is the specific opportunity that the gap between the prison alert raw chaos framing and the controlled, hushed, historically significant verdict scene creates for honest and consequential content about the accountability story. Audiences who are following the Trump legal story through the most dramatic possible framings are audiences who are genuinely interested in the accountability story and who are seeking content that captures its significance, content that uses the dramatic framing as an entry point and then delivers the honest, specific, documentarily grounded account of what the verdict day actually looked like and what it actually meant, is content that serves both the audience's appetite for the accountability narrative and their interest in understanding what actually happened. The guilty 34 times is real. The prison alert is real. The controlled formality of the scene is real. And the combination of all three, the most significant verdict in modern American political history, delivered with institutional dignity and received in hushed tension by a room that understood it was witnessing something no room had ever witnessed before, is a specific story that the raw chaos headline is trying to tell in its most dramatic possible form. What the prison alert unsealed verdict framing ultimately captures about the Manhattan courthouse verdict is the specific quality of the accountability threshold that was crossed when the foreperson's voice said guilty the 34th time. The specific quality of a legal system doing something it had never done before, producing an accountability outcome that the most powerful person in the country had believed or had behaved as if he believed he was insulated from experiencing. The prison alert is real. The verdict is real. The 34 counts are in the permanent legal record. And the courtroom scene that the headline's most dramatic framing imagines as raw chaos was actually something more consequential than that. It was the formal legal system, maintaining its dignity and its institutional authority at the exact moment that it was doing the most historically significant thing it has ever done to any American president. That is the specific accountability story that the verdict produced. Its significance is as large as any dramatic framing can suggest, delivered through the specific quality of controlled institutional formality that the legal system maintained even as it was crossing a constitutional threshold that no previous court had ever reached. The chaos was real. It just manifested in the political and constitutional universe rather than in the courtroom. And that distinction between the controlled formal scene inside the room and the political explosion outside is the most important thing to understand about what happened when the verdict was read. The final thing to understand about the verdict day story and why it matters for the ongoing accountability narrative is what the specific combination of the hush money conviction and the subsequently dropped federal cases means for the overall picture of Trump's legal accountability. The one case that reached trial produced a conviction on all 34 counts. The cases that were dropped not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the constitutional and policy architecture of the American legal system does not permit prosecution of a sitting president. The conviction exists. The charges that were dropped, the federal election interference, and the classified documents case produced the detailed public record of what prosecutors believe the evidence established, even without the formal adjudication of trial. The prison alert is the specific legal status of the convicted felon awaiting sentencing in the one case that was completed, and the entirety of the accountability story, the one conviction, the two dropped cases, the reports and the unsealed filings and the congressional transcripts, is the permanent legal historical record of what the accountability system produced in the most politically charged accountability period in modern American history. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in the controlled, formal, and historically unprecedented delivery of 34 guilty verdicts. And that eruption is permanent, documented, and as significant as any dramatic framing can describe. Make sure you're subscribed because this is going to keep developing and changing. This story is far from over.